So next thing we're going to be looking at is neurotransmission. So I talked about the big picture of how we collect sensory information and it's sent from our peripheral nervous system to our central nervous system, and then all of that processing and decision making, and then it sends back a decision. But how does that actually happen? Well, that happens through the process of neurotransmission. And what you're actually asked to be able to do by the syllabus is communicate neurotransmission using a diagram. So you need to be able to understand the process, but also be able to construct and identify a visual diagram of the process. So you need to be able to label a neuron, discuss what's going on in the synapse, and all of those types of things. So this is an example of a diagram that we have here. You can see we have the presynaptic neuron here. Pre meaning before, synaptic meaning synapse. So the neuron before the synapse, and then here we have the synapse, which is the gap between the two neurons. And then here we have the postsynaptic neuron, which is post after synaptic synapse, so the neuron after the synapse. And we can see this zoomed into this little diagram here. But I am going to go to my next slide, which has a little bit more details about it. So again, these slides are available if you want to download them and have a look at this in a little bit more detail. So this is a diagram of a neuron that I've actually drawn and labeled in quite a lot of detail. Probably one of the things I'm most proud of from my own senior psychology notes. But what I find really valuable about this diagram is it actually communicates the broader big picture of neurotransmission, which is this electrochemical message with a directive or information contained in it. How does that message actually pass from neuron to neuron so that we can have that communication within our nervous system? But then also the value of this having this little box here, which we had on our previous diagram as well, is we can kind of in essence do that zoom in and show in detail what's actually happening. So it's also really important to make sure that you know all of the terminology from a neuron so that you can be able to label that if you're asked to. So for example, we've got the nucleus, the dendrites, the cell body, we've got the axon and the myelin sheath, which is that fatty insulating protective layer that helps the messages get sent, which goes down the axon. And then to the axon terminal, and then we have the synapse, the gap between the terminal and then the next dendrite, where the chemical message is passed along to the next neuron, and that message continues. But just to briefly go into a little bit more depth, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the process of synaptic transmission, which is a little bit different to neurotransmission. So neurotransmission is kind of the term for that broader big picture. How is my message communicated from the first neuron to the second neuron, how it goes all the way along. But synaptic transmission is kind of that zoomed in process that I have highlighted in that box there. So what's actually happening in the synapse? How is that message actually getting from the end of the presynaptic neuron to the start of the postsynaptic neuron? So synaptic transmission, like we said, that process where the chemical messenger is a neurotransmitter. So a neurotransmitter is a chemical that communicates that message, and that's where it crosses the synapse from one neuron, or it could also be referred to as a nerve cell. So if you hear neuron or nerve cell, we're thinking the same thing. And it's this process, this is how the nervous system communicates. So the steps in neurotransmission, in synaptic transmission. So what happens is these neurotransmitters, so these little chemical messengers, they're contained inside vesicles within the terminal buttons, or you might hear it referred to as the axon terminal or the synaptic terminal of the presynaptic neuron. And what they do is they actually move towards the membrane. So they're moving towards the outside of the neuron. And then the vesicles actually break open into the synapse, and the neurotransmitter is actually released. And so once the neurotransmitter is released, you can see here we have our presynaptic neuron, and we've got the axon terminal. The vesicles are moving towards the membrane so that the neurotransmitter chemicals being released. And once it's released into the synapse, this gap between the neurons, the neurotransmitters can then bind with the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, which initiates the continuation of the communication in the next cell. So that's how our message kind of continues. So this little chemical is like communicating what the message is. So once it binds here, that message can then continue in the next cell. So that's how we have this like ongoing communication. Like I said earlier, neurotransmission is kind of the broader picture, which involves like the electrical signal passing down like the axon of the neuron, and it also involves that synaptic transmission, where the neurotransmitter is released into the synapse, and then this neurotransmitter either excites or inhibits the neuron. So if it excites, it's like telling it to do something, or if it like inhibits, that's kind of like when it's like preventing, like, no, don't do this. So it's kind of like that positive and negative effect. You might have learned about glutamate and GABA in relation to that. And then so if the neuron is sufficiently stimulated, which is when the threshold potential is reached, it'll send an electrical signal down the axon, and the message will continue. So again, it's that whole process of how is this message actually traveling through. And you actually do need to be able to draw this, because like what I have here, the syllabus actually explicitly says you need to be able to communicate neurotransmission using a diagram. And using that little zoom in that I've shown you here is also a great way to communicate this knowledge, to show that you know what's happening in the bigger picture. You know that the direction of impulse is kind of always moving from like the dendrites and like the cell body, like down to the axon terminal. I've also heard it referred to as like this is the head and this is the butt, so it always goes, or like the feet, so it always goes from like the head to the feet. So there's all of these other like little illustrations that you could use as well to help you really remember what all of the different parts are. So like what I was just talking about before, we actually have these neurotransmitters, which are these chemical messengers that are released within the nervous system to communicate between neurons. And here are 5 examples of neurotransmitters. Some of these are also hormones as well. And you actually need to be able to compare the physical and psychological functions or effects of each of these. So I'd recommend like doing some research, referring to your notes and all of that, and trying to come up with like a really solid, like, for example, like a table where you compare them, where you talk about their similarities and differences and what each of them do. So you need to be aware of like what effect they have on the body, like on the brain, and like a person's like psychological state, for example. Another thing that I'll quickly draw your attention to is the difference between neurotransmitters and hormones. So they're both chemical messengers, but the main difference is neurotransmitters are released within the nervous system, so they communicate within the nervous system, whereas hormones are released like outside of the nervous system. So some chemicals can exist as both neurotransmitters and hormones. So also being aware of where they're released and what that means for whether they're a neurotransmitter or a hormone. So the first one on our list is acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter that's found in like the brain and the spinal cord, and also in the peripheral nervous system. And it's involved in muscle contractions. So for example, like the lungs and the diaphragm to like help us breathe, as well as muscles involved in like digestion, and cardiac muscles involved in like beating the heart. It's also involved in like learning and memory, as well as REM sleep. So it's important to be able to discuss some of those functions of acetylcholine. And we'll also shortly be looking at an example of what happens when something goes wrong with acetylcholine. So by knowing what acetylcholine does, it makes it much easier to discuss what happens when it goes wrong, which is in the case of Alzheimer's. Our second one is epinephrine. If you haven't heard of that term before, you might have heard of adrenaline. The important thing to remember is that epinephrine and adrenaline, one and the same, just different names. So epinephrine or adrenaline is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter, and it's involved in like the fear response. So like fight, flight, freeze, and it's regulated by the autonomic nervous system, and it involves like increasing the heart rate and blood pressure. So again, it's about like mobilizing the body to act. Like you're in an emergency situation, so you need to be able to deal with it. A good way to remember that is thinking about like, what does adrenaline actually do? So think about like, in movies or in your own life when you're like, oh my goodness, like I've got such an adrenaline rush. like that's when you're in like a really dangerous or scary situation and your body is like super heightened, and your body actually physically reflects that. So that increased heart rate and blood pressure is so that you can get more oxygen and more glucose around the body, so that your body's like ready for action. And also like the increased respiratory rate, so you can get more oxygen to your muscles so that you're ready to like use that oxygen and respond to that dangerous situation. Epinephrine is released from the adrenal glands above the kidneys and also in the brain. And the important thing to know about this as well is that it occurs in intense bursts, which makes sense in light of what we probably know or have heard about adrenaline. Our next one is norepinephrine or noradrenaline, and is actually quite similar to adrenaline in a lot of ways. Also hormone and neurotransmitter, is also involved in mobilizing like both the brain and the body to act, so like the fight, flight, freeze response. Again, increasing heart rate, triggering the release of glucose into the bloodstream, increasing blood flow to the muscles, increasing alertness, arousal, regulating mood. But here's our main difference. And again, because we're looking at the similarities and differences between these hormones, it's important to be able to like make that differentiation. The main difference is that noradrenaline or norepinephrine, it's more of a slow release chemical that's released continuously at low levels. So how I think about it is like if you're in a super like emergency, like heightened situation, you're going to be getting like a massive rush of adrenaline. But adrenaline or like epinephrine, but that cannot be sustained for long periods of time. So the norepinephrine, noradrenaline, is kind of that like slow release chemical, and it's actually continuously being released at like low levels. So that's more of like the level kind of hormone. It does similar things, but it's more released like constantly at those low levels. Our fourth one is dopamine, which is again hormone and neurotransmitter, which means that it's present both inside and outside of the nervous system. And it's involved in like our thoughts, feelings, pleasure, like motivation and behavior, learning to associate a particular behavior with a reward, and also like a little bit of like it's associated with movement as well, which is also really important because we're going to be also having a look at what happens when something goes wrong with dopamine. Serotonin, our last one, hormone and neurotransmitter, again involved in regulating mood, especially like happiness and well-being, as well as like appetite and digestion, especially satiation, which is that like feeling of like feeling full. The sleep-wake cycle, memory, sexual functioning, the constriction of smooth muscles as well. So for example, like the slow, automatically constricting muscles like in the walls of your blood vessels and organs, for example. So yeah, those are just some of the functions of each of those. Again, I'd encourage you to make like a table of like the physical and psychological effects of each of them, and then also like the similarities and differences and their effect on, again, like the brain and body.